everybody. Welcome to the Evening Reader. My name is Priscilla, and today I want to talk to you about um, a book that I've read. It's starting in December, and I just finished it in March, and it's called Ninth Street Women. Lee Krasner, Elaine de Kooning, Grace Hartigan, Helen Frankenthaler, and Joan Mitchell, Five Painters and the Movement That Changed Modern Art. And it's by an author named Mary Gabriel, and it was published in 2018. And I picked this book up because, well, I'm interested in modern art in general, and I had put it on my TBR back in 2018. I even went and tried to buy it, and couldn't get a hold of a copy of it. I was gonna get the physical copy. Couldn't get a hold of a copy of it, but it stayed on my TBR for a long time. And then this past autumn, I was reading this book, The Cherry Robbers, which I've talked about before, by Sarai Walker. And the main protagonist in this book is a painter, a female painter. And Walker talks about using Ninth Street women as a reference for in research for this book. And the friend that I was reading this with said, "Hey, that sounds like a really good book." And I said, "Well, it's on my TBR, so let's do it." So we said, okay. And at the time, I think we both thought that we were going to be able to read it pretty quickly. But it turned out to be physical form. It's almost like, I think, around 950 pages. It's 720 pages of text. And then the physical book also has an appendix with paintings and then the endnotes. And I read mine on Kindle. So I had no idea how big the book was until I saw it in person at the bookstore, and I was like, it's also a big book. I mean, it's not just a thick book; it's like a big book. So yeah, so it took a while to read, mainly because I kept picking it up and putting it down to read other things, and also because there was a point at which it started to slow down a bit for me, which I will get into. So I think to start, I would say, so this book, who is it for? I mean, if you like abstract art, if you like art history, if you're interested in female painters, if you're interested in 20th century American culture, I think this could be a really interesting book for you. What it sounds like is that it's going to be a biography, five biographical treatments of each one of these five women painters. Is sort of what the impression I had from the title. And I saw this on Goodreads. It seems like other people also had this impression. But what the book really is it's a history of abstract expressionism from 1929 till around 1960. That includes these five women, but really what it's trying to do, or what Gabriel is trying to do, is she's trying to rewrite the history of abstract expressionism and write these women back into that history. Two of them have never really been left out of it, but their treatment, um, the sort of reputation or the story about them that's been told in the history is just only in relation to their husbands. Lee Krasner was married to Jackson Pollock, and Elaine de Kooning was married to the Dutch painter Willem de Kooning, and they have been overshadowed by their relationships with their much more famous husbands. And the fact that their husbands are more famous, I mean, they're probably the pillars of abstract expressionist art, Jackson Pollock and Willem de Kooning. So, I mean, it's not to say that those two painters should be lesser and the women should be more. It's more just that, unfortunately for those two women, they've really been overshadowed, and most of the focus has been on the relationships that they had with their husbands, as opposed to their own art, because they were both painters and they were both painting the entire time they were married to those men. So yeah, so she's actually doing an entire history of abstract expressionism over 30 years and the entire movement. And that is in the little, it's a very long title, but it is in that little subtitle. It's the movement that changed modern art. So She starts in 1929. She really starts with Lee Krasner, and the book is very focused on Lee Krasner for probably the first 200 to 300 pages, and then Elaine de Kooning comes in, and then it's a bit more about her and how she sort of arrived on the scene. But the first section of the book is really Lee Krasner, and she was there at the very beginning and really sort of sets up this immersive picture of the time and who was around and what Greenwich Village was like, especially during the Depression and the time during which Lee Krasner was working with the Works Progress Administration and the Federal Art Project, and the painters that she worked with on that, and also their sort of social scene, the clubs that they went to, the places they went, and sort of the the intellectual discussions that they had and who was a part of that. And it sets that up. And then in the mid 1930s, a lot of artists start to arrive from Europe as fascism begins to rise. They begin to flee because some of them are Jewish, and then also because some of them are just simply being persecuted because they're artists, and they're leaving. Artists started leaving Europe in sort of in droves, really, and showing up in this scene in Greenwich Village and really influencing uh, what the artists were doing. And it all just sort of came together in a weird magical moment that all of these modernist European painters, or I should say European modernist painters, I guess that would be better, arrived just in time to have enough influence to sort of change the landscape of painting forever, which is really amazing when you think about it. That it's just the weird confluence of events, and then World War II and the bomb, and then the Cold War and McCarthyism. And Gabriel covers all of this history and this movement. And she clearly wants to paint an immersive picture of this time between 1929 and 1960 as each of these women arrived on the art scene. But it's not just about the women, it's also about other painters, not just Pollock and de Kooning, but lots of other painters, male and female, sculptors, writers, gallery owners, uh, Alfred Barr, who started the Museum of Modern Art, which opened in 1929, the Whitney, all of the galleries, the literary circles. I may have said that already. She really has a huge cast of people in this book. And I would say that, like, sort of like a debut novelist who's really worried about verisimilitude and painting a scene and making it real, but that's how it really happened, and giving lots and lots and lots and lots of detail. Uh, the book suffers a little bit because she kind of she really just stuffs the book with people and with information. I mean, on almost every sentence has an end note on it, which was sort of interesting to me. Gabriel is a journalist. She's not I thought maybe she was an art historian. At times the book reads a bit like a dissertation that's been expanded, and at other times like a scholarly article, or articles maybe that have been put together and then fleshed out with this history. But it does turn out that she is a journalist. And that was interesting to me because I talked in my earlier video about Janet Malcolm and how good she is at character study, and how good she is at sort of painting a picture and just giving you incidents of who a person is or what a situation is, so that you understand sort of the greater part of it. And Gabriel just doesn't do that, really. It's more like she's very dogged, and it's very well documented. It's thoroughly researched, but she also really does feel the need to include everything. And uh, the book also really varies. This means the book varies in tone because she's trying to set up everything. So she's got the artists, she's got Greenwich Village at the time, but then she also sometimes will, veer into giving short history lessons about talking about the Depression or talking about Prohibition or talking about the rise of fascism or talking about World War II or when the bombs were dropped. And she drops in these little history lessons into this already very sort of detailed world. And also, pretty much every character she introduces, primary, secondary, tertiary, she feels like she has to give at least a half a page biography to where they were born, where they came from, what their training was, uh, who they were married to. It's just a bit, it's a bit much. It starts to become a bit much, especially once you're 400 pages into the book, and she's beginning to introduce the other three painters, Grace Hardigan, Helen Frankenthaler, and Joan Mitchell, and everybody that who is in their lives and in their circles. It almost becomes unwieldy in a way. Um, so like I would say it kind of veers from biography to history lesson to social commentary to gossip, then back to talking about art and the art world, and uh, I, it just gets to be a bit much. Now, what's interesting is a friend of mine who I read this with, because I was, like I said, I was doing a buddy read of this book, and she was a business major in college and went to business school after, did an MBA and all of that, and I was an English major and in humanities, and then studied, did a master's in English, and then part of a PhD, most of a PhD in English. And I took art history classes and philosophy classes and all of these things. And so a lot of this information was stuff that I knew, but she did not. She did not have a lot of this covered in classes or hasn't had it in other reading that she's done. So she actually appreciated a lot of the detail and a lot of the asides and the historical context, whereas I really wanted it to be more focused on the artists and maybe more closely focused on the artists and their relationships to each other, and also the painting. I wanted to know about the painting and about how the movement happened. Uh, so yeah, this cast of characters, it does include not just the women, but lots of other artists. The main secondary characters would be Hans Hofmann, who was the German expressionist. He had a school he came to the United States after World War I and opened a school in New York. Arshil Gorky, who was a huge influence on Krasner and de Kooning, Elaine de Kooning and Willem de Kooning in general. Jackson Pollock, obviously. Willem de Kooning would be, they're really primary characters also. Larry Rivers, who was very close to Grace Hardigan. Bob Motherwell, who was eventually married Helen Frankenthaler. And then Barney Rossett, who was the man who started Grove Press, who was Joan Mitchell's first husband. So those are sort of some of the primary characters. And then you've got the art critics. So Clem Greenberg, Harold, who wrote for Partisan Review and is a renowned modern art critic. This was really the rise of art criticism, and she does talk about that, and that is very interesting and very pertinent, I think, to the artists. Harold Rosenberg, who wrote for The New Yorker, and then Thomas Ness, who wrote for Art News, and also was a lover of Elaine de Kooning's and helped her get started as an art critic, actually. Because she was also an art critic and a social activist and a teacher in addition to being a painter. And then the gallery owners and the collectors, Alfred Barr, I said, who started the Museum of Modern Art. You've got Peggy Guggenheim, Betty Parsons, um, John Myers, who started the Tibor Denegi Gallery. And it's just lots and lots of people. And then you've got the literary people. You've got Frank O'Hara, you've got the poet John Ashbery, and then Barney Ross. It just is, it sort of just expands. And then that's not even everybody. There are a lot of people in this book. And it just, at some point, I said to my friend, I'm having a hard time keeping up with these people. It's like that relative that you have, or that friend that you have, who will just drop names of people, and you're like, who is that? Who? What? Or like, you know Jeffrey and Sandy. And it's like, who are the hell are Jeffrey and Sandy? I don't know who these people are. Yeah, Jeffrey came over, and Jeffrey was just saying, and you know how Jeffrey is. And you're like, no, I don't know who Jeffrey is. It sometimes starts to get to be like that. And it's like, did she introduce this person a long time ago and I don't remember who they are? Or did I miss something? I mean, it just gets a little overwhelming. So and I am looking at my notes because I'm trying to be, as I said, I read this over from December to March, and yeah, I really would have done it in pieces. Had I been reading it when I had this channel, I would have probably just talked about it in by sections, and then I would have been able to do a wrap up, and I think that would have been a little bit better. Uh, as far as the women go, she does a pretty good job, I think, of writing them back into the history of this. And all of the women, except I can't remember right off the top of my head, I want to say maybe it's Grace Hartigan, all of them have biographies written about them. Lee Krasner has several. Um, so those biographical treatments have already happened elsewhere. So, I think she's more concerned about fitting them into the fabric of the movement. Um, but they all wanted to be painters from a young age. And she does trace their development through the start of their art, who they were learning from, who they were influenced by, and then how they began to sort of pull away from those things and come onto their own. Like, for example, Jackson Pollock was a huge influence on Helen Frankenthaler uh, and Grace Hartigan, but more so Helen Frankenthaler. And Grace Hartigan, she actually learned, she didn't go to art school. She became a draftsperson during World War II when her husband went to war so that she could earn a living. And she ended up then deciding that art was her calling. And she actually said, I did not choose art. Art chose me. And she left her husband and young son and went to New York and said, I'm going to be a painter. I'm going to give up everything in life to be a painter. And actually, all of these women really did. Helen Frankenthaler and Joan Mitchell were from wealthy families, and they walked away from the sort of that world mostly. Helen Frankenthaler not as much as Joan Mitchell, but they mostly walked away from that world and said, no, we want to be artists. And they were really sort of criticized even during their time for wanting to be men, wanting to be like men, wanting to drink like men, paint like men. They didn't dress conventionally. They slept with whoever they wanted to sleep with. But really, they just wanted to be artists. They wanted to be the same as every other artist who was in that world. Um, so she does a good job, though, of really setting up their characters and helping us understand who they were. They were all obviously very different people. I think one of the best things that she does is rescue both Lee Krasner and Elaine de Kooning from this myth that they've both lived under, is that they sacrificed their art for their husbands, and they were under some great, repressive system, when they really, neither one of them were, and neither one of them ever said that about themselves. Krasner especially was absolutely adamant that she was Jackson Pollock's champion. She believed he was a genius, and she actually believed that the art the art movement, the movement of abstract expressionism or this modern art that was coming into play, that all of them would only benefit if the world could see his painting, and it would open people's minds, and it would help them understand so much more. So, but they were painting. They were always painting. Krasner never stopped painting. I mean, I think there's an impression that she gave up art until Pollock died in 1956. She was painting the entire time, but she was highly self critical and was very sensitive to criticism, not from Pollock, but from art critics and people like Clem Greenberg. And so she would destroy her work. She'd paint and paint and paint. It's been years painting, and then she would decide herself that she hated it and destroy it, or have one critical word from somebody who came to visit their house, and she would just trash it and start over again. But she never did stop. And that was her character. That wasn't because she was married to Pollock. So it's very interesting. And I think that she does that really well. And she really does paint an immersive picture of Greenwich Village and the scene there, and the salons and the clubs and the jazz, and then the poets and the writers coming in, and how the culture was starting to change and sort of move into, that mid-century 1950s, with the beats, and with literature sort of really becoming very, very interesting. And yeah, and she does a good job too of their scene. They would leave the city in the summertime, and they would go either to Europe, or they would go to Long Island, or they would go out to the Springs where Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner lived. They would do sort of decamp, and they would have like art camps, and they would have parties, and everybody would have houses. But the parties and the details and the gossip, it just becomes overwhelming. It just sort of like, and who are these people again? And why do I care about this party? And why do I care what they served? And why do I care that it went on for 2 days? I don't. It's just over and over. It just becomes a little bit repetitive. The other thing that's interesting that the book talks about is how the death of Jackson Pollock really changed art. You had this rise of, obviously, with the GI Bill and people going back to school. America became very prosperous in the 1950s, and there were magazines like Fortune who who were giving advice on how people should invest and how they should spend their money. And art was one of those areas of investment. And really, before Jackson Pollock's death, nobody probably would have considered buying some of this more modern art. This is the art that everybody says, oh, my 5-year-old could do that. Like, yeah, no, your 5-year-old probably couldn't do that, but that's another discussion. But after his death, it changed everything, and it changed the art market, and it changed it for the painters, and they were able to start to make a living. These painters who had literally lived in abject poverty for years, for decades, suddenly they were flush with cash, because it became something valuable to invest in. So that's a really interesting treatment also, the coverage of that. But I think ultimately, it's a good book to read. It's interesting. I wouldn't say that it could have been shorter, but I think it could have been more focused, and some of the details she's included could have been left out, and she definitely could have maybe not covered so much ground that's covered in other places. Maybe not so much with the history lesson. We can Google things now. You don't have to put it in the book. And I do suggest that you read the book like with your phone or your tablet or your laptop nearby, so that you can look at the art as she talks about the art and the artists. The book has an appendix with the art in it, but to flip back and forth in that big book, it's not going to work. So Yeah. Yeah, I recommend it. I mean, it was a 4-star read for me, 3.5 stars rounded up, just because I think it's a little too much detail, and it doesn't really have a great narrative tone. It's kind of all over the place, but it ultimately gets the job done. And I'm glad that I read it. And if you decide to pick it up, I would love to hear about it. If you have any books about art or artists that you'd like to recommend or any biographies, I would be interested. I'm interested in art history and in artists and in the creative life. And this book covers all of those things really well. So let me know what your thoughts are, or if you think you might pick this up. And please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. And I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Thanks a lot. Bye.